Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we assess the killing of a senior cartel leader in Mexico and the coordinated wave of violence that followed across multiple states, alongside a deadly maritime incident involving a Florida-registered speedboat intercepted by Cuban forces, which is likely to heighten security postures and increase detention risks for foreign nationals. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we examine Russia's intensified targeting of railway infrastructure across Ukraine, materially increasing the operational risk profile of rail travel, and growing indications that the United States is preparing for potential strikes against Iran if diplomatic concessions are not made. And in Asia-Pacific, we look at Pakistani airstrikes in Afghanistan following increased militancy inside Pakistan, as well as rising tensions between monarchist and Republican groups ahead of Nepal's 5th of March general election. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where the death of a senior cartel leader in Jalisco has triggered coordinated violence across multiple Mexican states. At around 1:10 p.m. local time on February 22nd, the Mexican Secretariat of National Defense carried out an operation in Tapalpa, in Jalisco state. The operation resulted in the death of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Several alleged CJNG members were also killed, and unverified reports suggest that either one of Mencho's sons or his brother-in-law was detained. In response to the operation, CJNG members set multiple vehicles alight across Jalisco and imposed a series of roadblocks, particularly in the heavily touristed town of Puerto Vallarta, as well as in Tapalpa and the Guadalajara metropolitan area. Several businesses, including supermarkets, banks, and petrol stations, were also targeted in acts of arson. In Guadalajara, cartel members allegedly warned residents to stay indoors or risk being targeted. Multiple flights were cancelled, and major international airlines suspended operations to the affected areas. The unrest spread to other parts of Mexico, with security officials reporting more than 250 blockades across 20 different states. Local authorities and several foreign governments issued shelter-in-place warnings. The governor of Jalisco urged people to remain in their homes until the situation is brought under control, and a red alert was issued for Jalisco state, including Guadalajara. As of February 26th, the United States has lifted its shelter-in-place warnings. Airlines have resumed normal operations at the affected airports, including those in Jalisco, and most schools and businesses have reopened. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Since its establishment in 2009, CJNG has grown into the most powerful cartel in Mexico. As its leader, El Mencho became one of the most wanted individuals in both Mexico and the United States, with U.S. authorities offering a $15 million reward for information leading to his capture. The operation that resulted in El Mencho's death follows months of increased U.S. intelligence cooperation with Mexico, alongside pressure from the Trump administration for Mexico to do more to counter the cartels. This included the designation of several cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. This has led to the creation of a new U.S. military-led task force specializing in intelligence collection on drug cartels, known as the Joint Interagency Task Force Counter Cartel. The task force, which includes multiple U.S. government agencies, was involved in the operation and reportedly provided key targeting data to Mexican forces. Its establishment and the resources committed to it almost certainly indicate that combating the cartels is a strategic priority for the Trump administration. Washington's intent is also likely to expand coordination with Mexican security forces. Past arrests or killings of key cartel leaders have often triggered immediate waves of violence. In October 2019, the arrest of Ovidio El Raton Guzman Lopez, son of Sinaloa boss El Chapo, led to severe unrest in Culiacan, an episode known locally as Culiacanazo. Confronted with extreme levels of cartel violence, authorities ultimately took the controversial decision to release Guzman. It is likely that the short-term wave of violence following El Mencho's death was intended as a warning to both Mexico City and Washington. The message was clear. Similar operations targeting senior cartel leadership will be met with rapid, coordinated, and destabilizing violence aimed at undermining the government and causing major economic disruption. However, the scale of the unrest and CJNG's ability to coordinate operations across at least 20 Mexican states was likely a shock to both Mexican and U.S. authorities. Tourist resorts and key transport routes are integral to cartel operations, acting as critical revenue hubs and logistics corridors. As a result, violence in these areas is likely to subside in response to security operations and the cartel's priority of preserving its revenue streams and maintaining freedom of movement. However, CJNG will highly likely continue to respond to the killing of its leader with targeted violence against the authorities and security forces across its areas of operations. CJNG grew into the most powerful cartel in Mexico by combining rapid territorial expansion with the absorption and co-option of smaller criminal factions, including groups that had splintered from larger rival cartels. El Mencho was instrumental in this process. He reportedly controlled nearly all aspects of the organization, provided its strategic direction, and enforced internal discipline. His death is likely to create an immediate power vacuum within CJNG, raising the risk of factionalism and internal instability. As seen with the fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel, this is likely to lead to competing succession claims and intra-cartel fighting. In the longer term, it is highly likely to result in a significant increase in cartel violence across Mexico. Staying in the region, Cuban border forces have intercepted a Florida-registered speedboat in a deadly exchange, an incident that is likely to further strain U.S.-Cuba relations. On February 25th, a Florida-registered speedboat, license number FL7726SH, entered Cuban territorial waters off the island's north coast. Cuban border forces intercepted the vessel near Cayo Falcones, leading to an exchange of gunfire. 4 people aboard the speedboat were killed and 6 were wounded. The Cuban Interior Ministry says it has identified 7 of the 10 passengers, 2 of whom were previously wanted in Cuba on suspicion of planning terrorist acts. According to the ministry, the passengers were dressed in camouflage, and assault rifles, handguns, homemade explosive devices, ballistic vests, and telescopic sights were seized. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that it was not a U.S. government operation, and that no U.S. government personnel were involved, but confirmed that the United States would conduct its own investigation to independently verify what occurred. Florida's Attorney General said he had instructed prosecutors to open an investigation, arguing that the Cuban government cannot be trusted, and we will do everything in our power to hold these communists accountable. Florida Congressman Carlos Jimenez added, "The dictatorship in Cuba has just attacked a boat from Florida and murdered those on board. This regime must be relegated to the dustbin of history." Now, our intelligence assessment. Based on initial reporting, the speedboat incursion can be plausibly attributed to several different actors. Irregular migration from northwest Cuba through the Florida Straits is common, and the attempted incursion may have been a family rescue operation. Cuba's current crisis is almost certainly the worst since the special period of the 1990s, and is highly likely to deteriorate further without a deal between Washington and Havana. Attempts at emigration are therefore highly likely to be elevated. Even before the current crisis, which followed the end of Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba in January, emigration rates were already very high. Between 2022 and 2023 alone, Cuba's population was estimated to have fallen by 18%. The vessel may also have been engaged in criminal smuggling, although this currently appears less likely based on the information available. The Cuban government's claim that the vessel's passengers were anti-regime Cuban exile militants attempting an infiltration cannot be ruled out. One of the men Cuba says it has identified, Conrado Galindo Sarriol, was interviewed in June 2025 by the anti-regime outlet Martin Noticias. The host described him as a legend and former political prisoner, while Galindo said he wanted to support the struggles Cubans face to achieve the freedom that is needed. Just as the incident coincides with what is highly likely to be an increase in emigration attempts driven by the current crisis, it also comes at a moment that almost certainly poses the greatest threat to the Cuban regime since the fall of the Soviet Union. Florida has a large population of Cuban émigrés who are generally staunchly anti-regime, and with pressure on Havana now dramatically intensifying, it is plausible that anti-regime militants would attempt an infiltration. The incident comes amid a severe fuel crisis in Cuba and the highest level of US-Cuba tensions in decades. The likely fallout includes a further escalation in rhetoric between Washington and Havana, as already reflected in the responses from US politicians and officials. If the US investigation concludes that Cuba used disproportionate force or unlawfully killed US nationals or residents, the Trump administration could use the incident as a pretext to increase pressure on the Cuban regime. Cuba is likely to heighten coastal security, raising the probability of additional confrontations, particularly with volunteer flotillas attempting to facilitate Cuban emigration. The incident is also likely to prompt a more assertive posture from domestic Cuban security forces against perceived infiltration threats. There is a realistic possibility that this could, in turn, increase the risk of arbitrary detention for foreign nationals in Cuba. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Russian forces have conducted large-scale strikes targeting railway infrastructure across multiple Ukrainian oblasts. Overnight, on February 21st to 22nd, Russian forces launched extensive layered strikes primarily against Kiev, Odessa, Kirovohrad, and Poltava oblasts. In total, 297 attack drones and decoys, along with 50 missiles, were launched. 14 missiles and 23 attack drones struck 14 locations. Notably, water supply systems and railway infrastructure were key targets, with rail facilities hit in Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Mykolaiv, and Odessa oblasts. On February 22nd, 2 improvised explosive devices detonated in central Lviv after police responded to a reported break-in at a retail store. The blasts resulted in 1 death and at least 25 injuries. The first device exploded as the initial police units arrived. The second detonated when additional officers reached the scene following the first blast. President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that several suspects have been detained, including a woman accused of planting the bombs on the orders of a Russian contact. He added that Russia coordinated the attack by recruiting the perpetrators through Telegram. Now our team's assessment. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which marked its 4th anniversary on February 24th, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, as well as the overall scale of Russian strikes, have evolved considerably. In 2022, the average size of Russian combined strike packages was around 100 munitions. By 2025, this had risen to nearly 300, while the intervals between major strikes had compressed significantly. Although Ukrainian air defense continues to improve, the sustained tempo of frequent large strike packages has consistently saturated these systems since the summer of 2025, with ballistic missiles in particular continuing to penetrate at high rates. Alongside the increased scale enabled by current production rates, the tactics, techniques, and procedures of Russian strikes have also evolved considerably. These changes have materially increased operational risks for travel to Ukrainian cities far from the front lines. Russian forces have highly likely intensified their targeting of densely populated urban areas, with civilian profile sites such as residential buildings being hit more frequently. The targeting of energy infrastructure has also risen sharply during each winter since 2022, when energy demands are higher and conditions for ground offensives along the front lines deteriorate. However, with the now dramatically expanded scale of Russian strikes, the impact has been greatest during the particularly cold 2025 to 2026 winter. The February 21st to 22nd strike package was notable for its coordinated targeting of rail infrastructure across 4 oblasts. This followed a drone strike on January 27th that hit a passenger train carriage in Kharkiv Oblast, killing 6 people, and a large-scale wave of strikes on February 16th to 17th that included drone attacks on railway infrastructure in Donetsk, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, and Chernihiv Oblasts. While Russian forces have previously struck rail targets, including the 2022 missile strike on Kramatorsk railway station, which killed 63 civilians, they are now highly likely increasing the priority of these sites. The director of Ukrzaliznytsia, Ukrainian Railways, has stated that in 2025, Russian forces carried out 1,199 strikes against depots, bridges, marshalling yards, substations, trains, and locomotives. This figure is far higher than the total for 2023 and 2024 combined. While military logistics rely heavily on rail, a second-order effect of these strikes is the broader increase in risk associated with rail travel, complicating risk management for anyone traveling to Ukraine. In response to the growing threat, Ukrzaliznytsia introduced new protocols at the end of 2025. Each train is now linked to a crisis center that provides real-time updates on ongoing attacks and can adjust routes accordingly. Locomotive armor has also been reinforced, although this reinforcement is not expected to withstand anything more than the lightest drones. Russian forces have almost certainly increased strikes against targets in western Ukraine, including Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Lutsk. This has eroded the region's former sanctuary status for logistics and international organizations, which had benefited from a comparatively lower long-range strike threat. The 22nd of February YMED attack in Lviv, highly likely intended as a double-tap bombing to maximize casualties among responding law enforcement, further underscores that long-range strikes are not the only threat in Ukraine's deep rear areas. With Russian intelligence services recruiting collaborators for attacks via Telegram, as is alleged in the case of the Lviv perpetrators, Russia has been able to conduct deniable attacks and acts of sabotage, not only within Ukraine, but across the rest of Europe. Also in the region, recent U.S. force dispersals and deployments suggest Washington is preparing for potential strike operations should talks with Tehran fail to produce concessions. The United States and Iran are scheduled to hold their 3rd round of indirect talks at the Omani ambassador's residence in Geneva on February 26th. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had been expected to submit Tehran's draft proposal on February 24th, which was intended to form the basis for further nuclear negotiations in Switzerland. However, a proposal was instead submitted on February 25th via Omani mediators, and it reportedly contains the key elements of a potential agreement. An unspecified Arab diplomat told Israeli media that Iran has continued to refuse to halt uranium enrichment or transfer its highly enriched uranium stockpile abroad, 2 of Washington's primary demands. However, the source said Iran is prepared to reduce its enrichment level from 60% to around 3.6%, which nearly matches the 3.67% cap set under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. During his February 24th State of the Union address, President Trump reiterated that, while he still favors a diplomatic solution, he would not allow Iran, which he described as the world's sponsor of terrorism, to obtain a nuclear weapon. He also alleged that Iran was developing ballistic missiles capable of reaching the U.S. mainland, a claim Tehran immediately refuted. After entering the Mediterranean Sea on February 20th, the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier sailed to Suda Bay in Crete, rather than proceeding directly to what had been assessed as her final deployment areas in the eastern Mediterranean. However, on the morning of February 26th, the USS Gerald R. Ford departed Suda Bay and set an easterly course through the Mediterranean. Multiple U.S. naval vessels have also departed the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, moving into adjacent waters, such as the Arabian Sea. Overnight on February 25th, the U.S. Navy withdrew all of its vessels from its base in Bahrain. In addition, a U.S. Navy dry cargo auxiliary vessel was observed entering the Mediterranean on February 26th. U.S. air movements have also continued, with multiple cargo flights observed heading to regional U.S. bases in the Middle East. 11 U.S. Air Force F-22 fighter jets departed RAF Lakenheath in the UK and forward deployed to the Israeli Air Force's Ovda Air Base, supported by key enablers such as air-to-air refuelers. Additional F-22s have also been deployed from the U.S. mainland to the staging ground at RAF Lakenheath, while further F-16s have been sent to Diego Garcia, which currently hosts multiple enabling assets, including air-to-air refuelers and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft. Now our assessment. After departing Suda Bay, the USS Gerald R. Ford is likely to enter its final deployment area within the next 24 hours, positioning the carrier to support potential strike operations against Iran. These operations would be enabled by refueling, ISR, and logistical assets that have already been pre-deployed across the Middle East. The F-22s, recently deployed to the UK, are likely to forward deploy to Israel to support the F-22s already at Ovda Air Base. This would strengthen the US fifth-generation presence and provide the capability to establish air superiority quickly and conduct suppression of enemy air defenses. Aircraft deployed to Israel are highly unlikely to face the same political sensitivities as those based in Arab states, which have publicly refused to allow the US to use their facilities for strikes against Iran. This gives Washington greater offensive operational flexibility than that offered by the two carrier strike groups currently in the region. Recent U.S. naval movements are likely indicative of a pre-strike force dispersal designed to maximize the survivability of high-value assets against potential Iranian retaliatory strikes. Iran has repeatedly threatened regional U.S. bases and has recently carried out multiple military exercises, simulating attacks on U.S. forces. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain lies within range of Iranian short-range ballistic missiles, which Iran has positioned along its coastlines. Concentrated naval assets at the base would be priority targets in the event of escalation, and have therefore been dispersed to reduce their vulnerability. Naval assets such as littoral combat ships have also been repositioned, as they offer limited capability during the opening stages of a major conflict. The redeployment of U.S. destroyers from the Red Sea to the Arabian Sea has likely been undertaken to mitigate the threat of Houthi retaliation in the Red Sea and to provide additional counter-ballistic missile coverage for the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which remains in the Arabian Sea. This dispersal of naval assets follows the partial withdrawal of U.S. aerial assets in the region to bases located outside the range of Iranian short-range ballistic missiles. Taken together, these measures likely indicate that the U.S. has moved from a deterrence posture to deliberate contingency preparation. However, this does not necessarily signal imminent strikes, as Tehran still has the ability to de-escalate or delay by committing to concessions during the third round of negotiations. Failure to meet key U.S. demands on February 26 will highly likely increase the risk of U.S. military action in the short term, particularly now that U.S. forces will soon be postured to conduct strike operations with improved survivability achieved through the dispersion of assets. This increased risk has almost certainly been reflected in warnings issued by national governments. On February 25, both Australia and Germany advised their citizens across the Middle East to prepare for potential airspace closures and widespread disruption. Germany's foreign ministry urged nationals travelling or residing in the region to exercise heightened caution, citing the possibility of a U.S. strike on Iran and the potential consequences for Israel. Canberra advised family members of Australian officials in Lebanon to consider departing while commercial flights remain available, and directed the families of officials in Israel to leave in response to deteriorating conditions. Australia also offered a voluntary departure option to relatives of officials stationed in Jordan, Qatar, and the UAE. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, Pakistan has conducted airstrikes in eastern Afghanistan following a surge in militancy and high-profile attacks inside Pakistan. On February 21st to 22nd, the Pakistan Air Force carried out coordinated airstrikes in Afghanistan's eastern border provinces of Nangarhar and Paktika. After the strikes, Pakistan's Ministry of Information and Broadcasting stated that the operations involved intelligence-based selective targeting of 7 terrorist camps and hideouts. Pakistan's Deputy Interior Minister also claimed that at least 70 militants were killed. Afghanistan has condemned the airstrikes, stating that they violated its sovereignty and airspace. Afghan officials also claimed that the targets included residential properties and a religious school, resulting in at least 17 civilian deaths, among them 11 children. The National Defense Ministry said it would deliver an appropriate and calculated response at the right time to the Pakistani strikes. On February 24th, Pakistani and Afghan forces exchanged fire along the international border, an incident Pakistani officials said was instigated by the Afghan Taliban. The clashes have since ceased, with the last skirmishes reported on February 25th. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Pakistan's airstrikes in Afghanistan follow a series of high-profile terror attacks and a broader rise in militancy within Pakistan, particularly from Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which Islamabad has long accused the Afghan Taliban of sponsoring or failing to restrain. The strikes also came in the wake of the 6th of February mass casualty attack on a Shia mosque in Islamabad. That attack has not been attributed to the TTP. It was claimed instead by Islamic State Pakistan Province, an affiliate of Islamic State that largely splintered from Islamic State Khorasan Province, the regional IS branch operating primarily in Afghanistan and parts of western Pakistan. Although the recent strikes reportedly targeted TTP-linked sites in Afghanistan, Islamabad has likely used the Islamabad attack to justify cross-border operations. Reports indicate that Islamic State militant networks in Afghanistan facilitated the mosque attack, and while these militants are hostile to the Taliban, their presence and operational freedom in Afghanistan have almost certainly reinforced Pakistan's long-standing claims. High-visibility airstrikes in Afghanistan will also likely help Islamabad appease domestic political audiences at a time when large-scale counter-terrorism operations in regions such as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan continue to overstretch security forces and undermine the government. Border clashes have become a standard Afghan Taliban response to Pakistani airstrikes. However, Taliban retaliation is unlikely to remain limited to brief exchanges along the international frontier. Their threatened and calculated response is likely to involve support for deniable attacks carried out by the TTP. These attacks will primarily target Pakistani security forces in western Pakistan. Nevertheless, there is a realistic possibility of Taliban-sponsored, high-profile, mass casualty attacks in major urban centers to demonstrate the Taliban's reach, undermine Islamabad, and restore deterrence after Pakistan's cross-border strikes. Further terror attacks linked to Afghanistan are highly likely to prompt additional Pakistani airstrikes inside Afghanistan. And finally, in Nepal, tensions between monarchist and republican groups are rising ahead of the 5th of March general elections, with sporadic violence highly likely. On March 5th, Nepalese citizens will vote to elect all 275 members of the House of Representatives, the lower house of the federal parliament. The elections were announced on September 12, 2025, by the President of Nepal on the recommendation of the government, following widespread anti-government demonstrations that led to the formal dissolution of the House of Representatives. Approximately 3,500 candidates from 68 different parties, along with several independents, are set to take part in the election. There have been no widely published or credible national opinion polls projecting party vote share. However, based on the previous election in 2022 and the seats held at the time of dissolution, there are 5 major contenders spanning the full political spectrum, from communist parties to right-wing pro-monarchist groups. The 5 major contenders are the centrist and historically dominant Nepali Congress, often referred to as the Congress Party; the second largest party, the Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Marxist-Leninist; the left-wing alliance known as the Nepali Communist Party; the monarchist Rastriya Prajatantra Party; and the newer reform-oriented Rastriya Swatantra Party. Now our intelligence assessment. The election will almost certainly become a contest between older established parties, such as the Nepali Congress, CPN-UML and NCP, and newer youth-oriented parties like the RSP. Among the established parties, candidates over the age of 40 dominate the nomination lists. This stands in contrast to Nepal's electorate, 52% of whom are between 18 and 40. The established parties largely retain support from rural voters, older citizens, long-standing party loyalists, public sector workers, and constituencies reliant on patronage. They have attempted to broaden their appeal to younger voters through greater use of social media. However, these parties have historically struggled to resonate with Nepal's youth, who tend to view them as entrenched in corruption, dominated by dynastic politics, unrepresentative of younger generations, and lacking meaningful internal democracy. Despite the appeal of less established parties and the influence of the youth vote, the Nepali Congress and CPN-UML remain the likeliest parties to win the most seats. They are the only 2 parties fielding candidates in nearly all 165 constituencies. Their combined strength was also demonstrated in the National Assembly election on January 25, 2026, where the Nepali Congress won 9 seats and CPN-UML won 8 out of the 18 contested. Furthermore, with 68 parties taking part, seat fragmentation is the most likely outcome, a dynamic that typically benefits parties with the broadest national base. The RSP is positioned as a key challenger, appealing strongly to Nepal's large youth base. However, its vote share in the 2022 election was 10.7%, compared with 25.7% for the Nepali Congress and 27% for CPN-UML. It would therefore need to more than double its support to compete realistically with the major parties. The monarchist RPP won 5.6% of the vote and is unlikely to emerge as a major challenger. Even so, recent pro-monarchy protests may indicate that it will increase its vote share. Sporadic violence is highly likely around the election. On February 9th, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office issued a warning stating that there is a risk of protests, political violence, and travel disruption ahead of the general election scheduled for March 5, 2026. Additional security forces have been drafted in to maintain order, with around 300,000 officers and temporary election police deployed as campaigning began on February 16th. One of the major lines of tension is between monarchists and Republicans. On February 18th, former King Gyanendra Shah called for the election to be postponed, warning that nationwide dissatisfaction could deepen political instability. Nepal has previously seen clashes between monarchist and Republican protesters during large pro-monarchy demonstrations in both 2023 and 2025. In each case, mass arrests were made and many people were injured, prompting security forces to deploy tear gas and water cannon, as well as to impose curfews. Clashes between monarchist and Republican groups are therefore highly likely in the lead-up to and on the day of the election. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.